Welcome to Dateline Health. This is Fred Lippman coming to you from the Alan B. Levan and Nova Southeastern University Innovation Center. And today we have a very exciting guest because we've had, as I always tell you, the viewers, these programs are created by your questions and your interest in certain things. And I would say over the last 2 to 3 years, the question, it's always been questions about cancer and surgery and heart disease, but now it's moved into cancer and heart disease and Alzheimer's or dementia. And we have an incredible individual by the name of Dr. Benedict C. Albensi, who is the chair and professor of the Department of Pharmaceutical Sciences in the Barry and Judy Silverman College of Pharmacy. So welcome, doctor.
Good morning. How are you? Thank you for having me today.
I know that you're going to you do your NIH grants relate to Alzheimer's issues per se, but a lot of the questions that come our way are in a way in which the public is viewing it. They look at dementia and Alzheimer's in the same verbiage description. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and we'll ask you a few questions that the public has asked us. So welcome. It's all yours.
Thank you. Well, it's really my pleasure to be here today. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Like many other physicians and scientists, I started out with a curiosity about the brain and intelligence and memory. And then about 22 years ago or so, I branched out into Alzheimer's disease. But I think what changed for me is that when my mom and my aunt both developed dementia a few years ago, that really changed my perspective, and I took it more personally. So, it's a different type of motivation. We have to get out there and we have to try to find better solutions, improve care, and improve research.
I'm glad to see that the newscasters, we have so many different news programs on television now, and of course everybody has their little cell phone and iPads that they receive information on. But there's so much talk and relationship to the loss of individuals, not through death, but through, I would say, brain malfunction. I would assume that's where you would be going. And they relate to it as serious, shall we say, non-understanding. They just can't understand. We've taken good care of mom and dad, or my son and my daughter, and we've done everything that we could do, but what's happened to their brain?
Well, that's a great question, and that's a great place to start the conversation. So, there's several risk factors for Alzheimer's and various types of dementia. Alzheimer's disease is one type of dementia. It's the most common type of dementia, but there's at least 3 risk factors that play a huge role in the development of Alzheimer's disease. So the greatest risk factor is aging, of course. And then we also have genetics, and we have other environmental factors. And sometimes those come together for the perfect storm. So that's the other aspect.
Let's get some feel on how it shows up, because the people who are, and I don't want to say suffer, I want to say, in a sense, they're wonderment, because they're the ones who end up, the moms, the dads, the aunts, the uncles, the children, they end up being the caretakers. And certainly, I believe, at least in what I've observed through different literature views, the impact on these individuals is rather dramatic, because you're talking to someone that you love or care for, and all of a sudden they don't know who you are, or they don't remember anything. So let's talk about that.
Well, that's a great point to bring up, because, across the world, we have maybe 55 million people or more that have some sort of dementia. In the US, it's over 6 million people. In Florida, we have almost 600,000. But if you look at the number of caregivers that are necessary for those 600,000, it's more like 850,000. And so the caregiver's role is really underappreciated, and how much stress and time it takes, and how oftentimes people are really unprepared to take that caregiving role. So it's a huge problem, and we've barely scratched the surface on this.
Well, you know, for quite a while here in the state of Florida, the government was helping create respite centers in various, you know, churches, synagogues, whatever, attached to them, so that the families that were taking care of these people or loving these people as well, obviously, they needed a break themselves before they get psychologically depressed. And I'm sure that you, in your research, you find these people who have to communicate with you relative to the actions that have led them to bring them into your research programs. So you want to talk about that for a while?
Yeah, so that's an interesting aspect too, because, you know, we talk to the families, we talk to the caregivers, and oftentimes not only are they unprepared, but they don't have all the information that they need. And so we tell them the current state of affairs, and it's a very sad situation. So, for example, if you look at all the chronic disease out there, age-related disease like cancer or HIV or stroke, heart disease, you know, we're really actually doing pretty well. That many of those diseases and conditions are declining, but not so. This is not true with Alzheimer's disease. In fact, the rates keep going up. So this is the message, and this is the information that we have to translate to the families, that we're really losing the battle. It's a very depressing sort of conversation at times. And that's just that part. The other part has to do with the drugs and the treatments. So over the years, we've had pretty much 5 different drugs that attempted to target 2 different mechanisms. Now, recently, over the last 2 years, we have 2 new drugs that work by a new mechanism. And we have to wait and see how well these really are, how well these new drugs actually work. But there are considerations. They're expensive. You have to get IV infusion. So it's not an easy fix. So there's so much room for improvement. And this is a very hard thing to translate to families, that we can't just give you a drug and make it all better. There is no cure for Alzheimer's disease, and we have so much more room for improvement with the treatments. So compared to epilepsy, compared to even cancer, when I was a kid, cancer was a death sentence almost, and that's not the case anymore. We have a variety of treatments that are effective, and we can manage people quite well for different types of neurological disease and other types of chronic disease, much better as compared to Alzheimer's.
You know, in reading some of your working around your research, I noticed that there are sex differences in Alzheimer's disease, particularly in females. You want to talk about that?
Well, the sex different issue has been neglected for so many years. It started really with a lack of evidence in clinical trials, and even the scientists often use animal models. And for so many years, women in female mice or rats were just neglected in the studies. And that was primarily because it was more complicated. It was more complicated to study females because their hormonal cycles are more complex. But this was a great disservice to the entire nation and the community for not looking at sex in males equally. And the other thing, of course, is that over the years, we've learned that personalized medicine and precision medicine, these are topics that are in the news, is really the wave of the future. And using these techniques involving genomics and other types of new tools that we're going to have as we move forward in time, we're going to have better tools for dealing with not only males versus females, but also, you might be Italian, or you might have some other ancestry, you might be Hispanic, and we're going to start treating people differently depending on their genetic constitution. So all these factors play a huge role in treatment possibilities. But with sex differences, this is something we've been studying in my lab for almost 8 or 9 years now. Before coming to Nova, I was a professor up in Canada, and I had major federal funding I had a clinical trial, and I also had another study to look at sex differences. And we kind of stumbled across this, actually, to be honest. We did not realize that we were going to see important sex differences that affected female mice earlier than male mice. That was the first thing. And we also found that these sex differences occurred very, very early. And that was another very interesting observation. So, for example, many people talk about the classic hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, the sticky toxic proteins, these amyloid plaques. And then there's also the tangles that occur. And both of these can disrupt both communication and transport in the cell. Well, we discovered that some of these mitochondrial changes, this is another organelle in the cell, in the females, this was disrupted very early, much earlier than the appearance of these plaques and tangles that many people talk about. So that's what we've been following up on. And we've been looking at important sex differences that involve this mitochondria, this organelle that supplies the ATP or the power to the cell. It works very much like your furnace in your house that supplies the heat. You got to remember, I'm talking from a northern perspective. I'm still getting used to Florida, right? We don't talk about heaters down here as much, but just like the furnace in your house that supplies energy, the mitochondria supplies the energy to the cell, the ATP, the chemical that's important to keep life going on. And so the output of ATP and the effects on ATP are quite different in males versus females. And that's another aspect of some of our research.
Yeah, relative to, and you brought this up before, and I'm going to tie them together, but could you explain to our listeners what mitochondria is?
Yeah, so the mitochondria, if you took a class in high school biology, they call it the powerhouse of the cell because it very much is like a power plant. And so it produces the energy currency. So every cell is alive because of the energy that's generated from the mitochondria in the form of ATP. This is a molecule that's so critical to life in both plants and animals. And without it, we would die. And in fact, as we age, the mitochondria are not pumping out as much energy. And this is a huge factor in how it affects the immune system and how it can increase the risk for diseases like Alzheimer's disease. So the mitochondria is so critically important. And so that's another thing that we do in my lab is that we're trying to target biochemical intermediates so that we could look for new drugs that actually target the mitochondria. And so some people call this mitochondrial medicine. So right now there are no FDA approved mitochondrial medicines, and that's what we're hoping to change. That's what we're working on in part. And of course they have to be sex specific because there are so many differences that we're learning about between males and females.
You know, you were talking about drug therapies before. The so-called biobatteries of the cell could be the future of medicine. Am I correct?
Exactly. I mean, that's the view I share, and that's the focus of much of the research in our lab. And I like the term that you use, biobatteries, because that's an excellent way to think of it.
Let me ask you another thing that we're in football season now, and we hear, or we see, actually, I mean, we see so much damage that's done to the head and neck area. Obviously, right here in South Florida, the #1 quarterback for the Miami Dolphins was out, and now they have protocols, for head injuries. They call it many different things at different places, but head trauma, is that involved, or is it a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease?
Well, we're still trying to figure that out. So before I got involved in my Alzheimer's research 18 years ago, I actually formally studied head trauma and stroke. And there are a lot of similarities between stroke and head trauma. So in fact, one of my new NIH grants with my collaborator, Dr. Lisa Robinson here at Nova Southeastern, involves a head trauma model. So the overall impression and the evidence suggests that head injury or blast injury. We see this in sports. We see it in different soccer and football. We see it in soldiers in combat. These types of injuries to the brain increase the risk for different types of dementia. So we know that the evidence is quite strong for Parkinson's disease and ALS, but we're still trying to figure out if it causes and is a risk factor for Alzheimer's. We believe it is, but the evidence is more mixed. And it's very interesting. You bring up the example of football. In fact, there was a really great study published in a neurology journal about 4 or 5 years ago that looked at specific football players and what position they played and which position was at greater risk for dementia or ALS or Parkinson's. And that seemed to be the wide receivers, because the wide receivers traveled at greater velocity when they're running down the field to catch the quarterback's throw, right? So there certainly is a increased risk for dementia, and we believe that there's an increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. But again, the data and the studies are more mixed, and that's exactly why we have the funding that we have to further study this in more detail.
We've had questions from viewers who are the parents of children. Should they ask us? I can't offer an opinion, but that's why we have people like you to offer an opinion relative to the type of protections that are necessary. For example, many years ago here in the state of Florida, there was a long-standing mission by a group of surgeons, different individuals that were researchers, to make sure that children who ride bicycles should wear helmets. And people said, why do they want to have helmets? Because you want to protect their heads. So that's really what you're talking about, correct?
That's right. And there have been a lot of improvements in helmets over the years. We still need a lot of evidence and data. I gave a talk at West Point about 10 years ago about blast injury in soldiers. And the huge thing that's really neglected is baseline. We don't always have enough baseline data. So we know that these playing different sports and having concussions will increase risk. But how many concussions? And what's the intensity of the concussion that's necessary? So what I'm saying is that we used to think that you had to have a major concussion where you lost consciousness that would really increase your risk for these types of dementias. But maybe not. Maybe it's a series of mild concussions where you don't actually lose consciousness. So we're starting to think, well, maybe that's just as important or even more important. So the devil's always in the details. And so helmets are going to add some protection. And of course, many sporting organizations have created concussion protocols for the coaches to follow, and this is important. But there's a lot of things to consider. And just like stroke, there's a so-called secondary injury. You have the mechanical hit to the brain, hitting the skull, whatever, from the contact sport or a bullet or whatever. But then you have a series of biochemical reactions. That's the so-called secondary injury that actually occurs over weeks to months later. And that's something that we have to think about more carefully and how to treat that pharmacologically.
Let me ask you this. We've had a lot of folks that, in fact, we had 2 or 3 inquiries from viewers about their visits to, I guess these were people over the age of 70, all right? If I'm not mistaken, and because they usually they indicate somewhere, well, I'm 75 or I'm getting older and I've been on Social Security for the last 10 years. So we know that they're in their 70s or plus. And they get their annual checkup, and a lot of the folks go to a neurologist, referred to a neurologist by their internal medicine or family doctor, or OB/GYN, actually, in many cases. And they talk about forgetting facts, forgetting names. And I think 2 or 3 of the people said that the neurologist told them, just calm yourself down, because within the 2 or 3 minutes afterwards, you're going to get the name. Do you have any comment about that?
I think we all have to appreciate the fact that as we get older, we're going to start forgetting things, and that's a normal part of aging. But there's a huge difference between that sort of age-related forgetting and Alzheimer's disease. So, for example, with Alzheimer's disease, not only is there memory decline, but you start seeing the appearance of very unusual behaviors. So if you put your keys in the refrigerator, for example, that's not something that happens normally, right? So you develop not only the memory decline, but you might start getting agitated. You might start wandering. You might start forgetting how to get home. And home is someplace perhaps you've come home to every day for 30 years. So those are the sorts of traits that are more of a concern, and that are more, really indicative of the Alzheimer's disease.
Well, it seems, and also we had a comment recently because, or more than one comment. We had, I don't want to necessarily name the musical professionals. They were singers, and one of the individuals has had, in quotes, Alzheimer's for developed in the last 12 years. But yet, the person can come onto the stage, hear the music, and all of a sudden, all the lyrics come back. Is that a phenomenon that's being viewed or researched, or what is it?
To be honest, I don't think most scientists fully understand that. And that is such an interesting observation. And we see it in different ways. I mean, not only do we see these performers remember the lyrics differently, we also see people with Alzheimer's disease react very positively to music therapy. And my mother was an example. She was in her 20s during World War II. And that was one of the only things that calmed her down, was listening to music from the big band age. So all the big bands and Benny Goodman and all those sorts of all that sort of music was one of the only things that would reduce her agitation. So it's so interesting how music plays a role in so many different ways, and in terms of remembering lyrics, remembering melodies, and as opposed to and that's partly because we have different types of memory. We have short-term and intermediate form emotional memory. We also have memories for facts and events versus how to ride a bicycle. So there's lots of different forms of memory. And I think maybe you've hit on something there, is that remembering music is perhaps even more specialized, and we really have a lot to learn yet about that.
Let me ask you this, because we're down to our last 4 minutes of the show. Tell us, when you are doing research, you're doing research by communicating with individuals, correct?
Yeah, in our clinical trials, of course, yes.
So if people want to offer themselves to you and your research, is there a way for them to communicate with you?
Well, certainly if one contacts the College of Pharmacy at the Terry Building at Nova Southeastern University, my professional email address is my first initial last name, Albensi@nova.edu, or they could call the College of Pharmacy to get in touch with me.
Good. Okay. Well, you never know who's going to show up to be someone for you to study. Anyway, we want to thank you, Dr. Benedict Albensi. We really appreciate you being here. I never asked you, where were you trained, in what university?
I got my Ph.D. at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. My Ph.D. is in neuroscience. I did postdoctoral training at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and then I did a second postdoctoral fellowship at the Sanders Brown Center on Aging at the University of Kentucky in Lexington.
Well, see, I wanted the folks who are listening to know that we have a real certified, knowledgeable individual. Not that I didn't think so, but I want the folks out here who are viewing the show to know of your training and your capacity to be able to perhaps see and speak to some of these individuals that are, shall we say, blighted by a disease that very few people are, I shouldn't say very few people are working on, but very few advantages have come to us by creating drug products and others to deal with their disease. So thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate you being here. We're very honored to have you as part of the Barry and Judy Silverman College of Pharmacy. Folks, I hope that we brought to you information that is interesting, valuable, and we communicated some of the questions, or answers to the questions that you brought to us in your comments. Remember, this show is called Dateline Health. Take good care of yourself. My name is Fred Lippman. I come to you from Nova Southeastern University. Until next time, see you.